Lincoln, of course, towers to the top on most scholars' lists as one of the best presidents. But as with all human beings, there is also a dark side. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which is the protection against illegal imprisonment. You must show cause as to why you are imprisoning me. He even may have ordered the arrest of a Supreme Court judge, which was not carried out. This does not diminish his accomplishments, but what if he was on the verge of actually losing that war? What would he have done? Although the South had initial successes, there was no way to victory for the South. The North's wealth, the availability of draft aged men, the manufacturing power of the North, the rapid improvement of arms and the mobility of the North, the South was not going to win that war. Again, this does not diminish anything he did, but there is a dark side to all of this. He probably broke more constitutional laws than any president we have ever had. He was also not an abolitionist that people think. They think, "Oh, wow, he was against slavery. He was against slavery." No, it wasn't quite that way. He didn't really want to end slavery. He wanted to stop its spread. He didn't particularly like slavery, but he did not think African Americans should have the same rights as white people. He even wanted to send them back to Africa, particularly to Liberia, whose capital, Monrovia, is named after James Monroe, our fifth president, who also wanted to send the African Americans back. The Emancipation Proclamation was not about slavery, it was about politics. It had several intentions. The first was hopefully it would cause some Southern slaves to flee or revolt. If they fled, it would hurt the Southern colony. If they revolted, it would tie up soldiers to have to deal with these revolts. Secondly, it was thought that it might give the war more of a meaning, a better cause to fight for. One huge and incredible thing that it did, it stopped the Europeans from interfering in the war. There was no way Britain or France was going to come down on the side of Southern slavery. That just was not going to happen at that time in Europe. What it did not do, though, it did not free one slave anywhere in America. Lincoln did not have the means of enforcing it. It only applied to states that were in rebellion. The only states that were in rebellion were the southern states where Lincoln had no means to enforce the slavery issue, no means of freeing the slaves. Hence, states like Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware that had slavery were able to keep their slaves because their states were not in revolt. Further, as southern lands were conquered, sometimes the slave owners were allowed to keep their slaves because technically, though areas were no longer in revolt, those areas were conquered. Lincoln said himself that if saving the Union means freeing all the slaves, he would do that. If saving the Union meant freeing none of the slaves, he would do that. If saving the Union means freeing some of the slaves and not others, he would do that. The Emancipation Proclamation freed no slave. Lincoln's goal, his virtually only goal, was to save the Union at any cost. Again, it's not really criticism. If he'd have freed those slaves in those four states might have joined the Confederacy. And if they'd have joined the Confederacy, that means they would have had more soldiers, they would have had more equipment, and they would have had more resources. He was a man of the times and did what he thought he had to do. Hindsight is 20/20, and it is patronizing. None of us knows what our position would have been if we were raised in those times. If you think you do, I think you're deluding yourself. Lincoln was born on Sinking Spring Farm on February 12th, 1809, close to Hodgenville, Kentucky. That is about an hour south of Louisville. An hour by car, not back then on horseback. The Lincolns eventually moved to Indiana. His father had lost their farm due to the iffy nature of Kentucky land titles. His mother had died when Abe was 9 years old. His sister of 11 took care of him while Lincoln's father worked. His father remarried, and Abe was very close to his stepmother. Abe was a strong lad and a good wrestler. He helped his father with the farm. The Lincolns would move again to Illinois, and shortly afterwards, Lincoln went out on his own. Lincoln began working at a general store when he decided to volunteer for the Illinois militia as a captain during the Black Hawk War with the Indians. When he came back from the war, he and William Berry bought a general store for themselves. Berry also bought a liquor license, which was probably not a good idea because Berry later became an alcoholic. Lincoln educated himself with borrowed books and a few bought books. He would study law, and he would be admitted to the Illinois bar in 1836. He managed to win a seat in the Illinois State House. After a canceled engagement, he eventually married Mary Todd in 1842. They had 4 children, but only one lived past the age of 18. Lincoln attempted to get into the Senate in 1854, but was unsuccessful. When Stephen Douglas was up for re-election, Lincoln tried to defeat him, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates were on. Douglas defeated Lincoln for the Senate position in Illinois in 1858, but these debates boosted Lincoln into a national figure. There were 2 issues in the 1860 presidential election. They were tied together. It was slavery and Southern secession. Now, most are not talking about ending slavery, including Lincoln. There were some that were, but most were just talking about ending the spread of slavery. The newly formed Republican Party had several nominees, but Lincoln would end up securing the nomination. There were 4 contenders for the presidency in the 1860 elections. They were, of course, Lincoln, the Republican, John C. Breckinridge, a Southern Democrat from Kentucky, John Bell, a constitutional unionist from Tennessee. Basically, the Unionists just wanted everything to stay the same. The Constitution, the slavery, everything just the same. And Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois. Lincoln won the 1860 election with 180 electoral votes. He won 18 states and 39.8% of the popular vote. Breckinridge received 72 electoral votes, 11 states, and 18.1% of the popular vote. John Bell received 39 electoral votes, carried 3 states, and 12.6% of the popular vote. Stephen Douglas received 12 electoral votes, carried 1 state, and got 29.5% of the popular vote. In Lincoln's inaugural address, he reiterated that he had no intention of directly or indirectly interfering with the institutions of slavery that were already in existence. It must be said, however, that it just wasn't about slavery. There is also the issue of states' rights. Many people, particularly Southerners, did not like the idea of Washington telling them what to do. It was like being a a colony again, with Britain telling us what to do from London. Lincoln and Republican leaders agreed that the Union could not be dissolved. On April 12, 1861, when the South opened fire at Fort Sumter in Charleston Bay, the war was on. Lincoln is sometimes criticized for not understanding the depths of the problem. William Tecumseh Sherman said he didn't realize the country was sleeping on a volcano. But Lincoln was determined not to be the first one to fire a shot. In fairness again, there was probably no resolution except war. We're not going to cover that war because that is a huge subject on its own. But just to say, I think Lincoln did a remarkable job on balancing the war between domestic politics, the resources involved, and how far he was willing to go at any one time. Initially, Lincoln was worried about his chances of winning the election of 1864. However, he easily won his re-election against former General George McClellan. Lincoln received 212 electoral votes. He won 22 states and received 55.1% of the popular vote. McLean got only 21 electoral votes, carried only 3 states, and received 44.9% of the popular vote. When the war ended, Lincoln did not want to punish the South, but rather work with them to rebuild the country. However, Lincoln was only in office for a little over a month when John Wilkes Booth assassinated him at Ford's Theater on April 11th, 1865. Lincoln was one of the poorest presidents we had. He was on the bottom 10, with a peak wealth of below $1 million in today's money. Thanks for listening, and please hit the subscribe button and like.